Welcome and good evening. This is episode 8 of the new News Project Live. Information tragedy, COVID-19 silence, misinformation, and confusion. Our guest is Brian Stelter, the anchor of Reliable Sources and chief media correspondent for CNN Worldwide. Our hosts are Merrill Brown, CEO of the News Project, and Alex Leo, head of audience. The News Project Live is a weekly conversation with media industry experts and innovators about the future of news, brought to you by the News Project. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Please share, and please comment, and please tag your friends who should watch this very interesting show. Without further ado, Merrill Brown and Alex Leo.
Good evening from New York City. I'm Merrill Brown of the News Project, and welcome to tonight's edition of the News Project Live. Thursday evenings, we bring some of the smartest minds in media together to talk about news industry issues and the business issues that make the future of news gathering and news organizations so challenging. Tonight, one of the most closely listened to of those minds, CNN's Brian Stelter, joins us from his New York home. As CNN's chief media correspondent and anchor of CNN's Reliable Sources, Brian offers influential reporting and commentary in a coveted Sunday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern time slot. He and a team publish a daily, widely read Reliable Sources newsletter. He reports and writes for CNN.com. He appears often on CNN's air and has taken strong positions about President Trump's criticism of the press, has been outspoken about the federal government's inadequate response to the coronavirus, and his reporting on changes in the media landscape and the news industry in particular is sadly one of the few national sources of very thoughtful coverage of these issues. We'll be talking to Brian about the news of the moment, the virus, what newsrooms should and are doing about their virus coverage, and much more in just a minute. At our company, The News Project, we're working to build technology and services to help small to medium-sized news organizations handle the product and marketing challenges they face every day. We have a technology operation that puts them in a position to grow and build audiences and seek sustainable business models. More on our work later when Alex and Leo, my co-host, and I debrief. And please send us your questions for tonight's show for Brian. Alex joins us tonight from her home in Washington, D.C., where the nation's capital is beginning a very different July 4th weekend. Alex, good evening.
Thanks, Merrill. Welcome to all our viewers. Please tell us in the comments where you're watching from, tag your friends to join you, and leave us your questions for later in the show. Merrill?
On to tonight's show. Brian Stelter's story is well known to many news folks, but as it is an extraordinary story, it's worth recounting to our many viewers tonight outside the media. In 2004, Brian Stelter, as a Towson University freshman, founded a newsletter called Cable Newser, which morphed into TV Newser, and which he wrote for a time anonymously. Brian boldly called news industry executives and on-air talent, broke stories, and became a must-read, even as he became editor-in-chief of his college paper. 6 months or so in, he revealed himself in the pages of the New York Times, no less, sold the blog, continued to write for it, and in what was certainly an eye-opening hire, wound up as a media reporter at the Times directly out of college. A different definition of working your way up through the business. He covered TV and digital media for the Times until joining CNN in 2013. He wrote a widely read book, Top of the Morning, Inside the Cutthroat World of Morning TV, which inspired Apple's TV show, The Morning Show. And out late next month, in August, is his next book, Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. The book's promotion describes it, quote, as the untold story of the collusion between Fox News and Donald Trump, and goes on to say the book, quote, exposes the media personalities who, through morally bankrupt, profit outrageously by promoting the president's propaganda and radicalizing the American right. I suspect that Hoax will find an audience and get some attention. Welcome, Brian. You're working at home these days, have 2 small children, and no doubt it has been challenging on many levels.
I wrote the entire book in this room, which is my home TV studio now. Yeah,
that would be the room where it happened, Brian. Tell us a bit about lockdown life.
Lockdown life for me. Everybody has a story about this. Everybody has a last normal day before everything was upended. For me, it was a Sunday night in early March. I was downtown with my wife. We went out to dinner. We had pizza at this eerily deserted restaurant. In retrospect, I think people realized what was going on before we did. And then to me, the next day, everything started to shut down. I think, the day that I remember most vividly was when my wife, who works at New York One, Jamie, she's a morning show host at New York One in New York City. She came home with these 2 big boxes, which are now hidden under the bed. And in those boxes were the TV camera and the lights and the setup and all the monitors and stuff, which has now taken over this bedroom for the last 3 months. In some ways, I have to say, this is an improvement. This is a better way to produce television. Last night, CNN asked me to jump on for some breaking news with only 10 minutes of notice, and I never would have been able to make it to the studio in time. So there are some silver linings about this new way of working, but it's also been incredibly difficult. As lucky as we are to have jobs in television news right now, like as lucky as me and my colleagues are, it's definitely taken some getting used to. And a lot of folks at CNN, like myself, who have programs on the schedule, still go into the office for those shows. So I go into the office on Sunday. There's nobody else there. I see one other person, and then I work here the rest of the week.
Well, that's quite a story and quite a life. And as a watcher and reader, thank you for enduring all that and helping us all sort through the moment. Speaking of the moment, let's dive right into the virus. The CDC recently announced, and you and I had an exchange about this on Twitter that was very interesting. They announced the number of COVID infections could be 10 times higher than previously reported. I noted on Twitter, and you responded, that the news was given in a conference call with only a few reporters having access to it. There was no national press conference. There was no White House briefing. Tell us more about what you and I are calling an information tragedy and what it means to our world as we cope with coronavirus.
Right. When you used that term, it let off a light bulb in my mind, because there's obviously a medical tragedy, a health tragedy that's front and center. There's an economic tragedy layered on top or layered below. And then there's an information tragedy on top of all of this, surrounding all of this, because people don't know what to trust, what to believe, and because the experts of the government are not being allowed to speak as robustly as they should. So here's the item for the Reliable Sources newsletter. You pointed out this is not just in the U.S. In Britain, there's been the same problem. These daily press conferences have ended there. We've seen some of the governors in some of the states also be restrictive in terms of the media. Texas Governor Abbott had to be shamed into agreeing to go on Univision, and he finally agreed to go on the Spanish language TV this week and try to help talk to people who are being affected by the pandemic. I think when we look back in 10 or 20 years, it's going to be so shameful that the government's leading health and medical and science experts were not more visible. And when I say visible, what do I mean? I mean on national television in prime spots. I mean on national radio all the time. I mean giving interviews to the biggest outlets in the world. Today, Dr. Anthony Fauci called into a radio show in London. He was on the BBC. That's great. That's good. He should have also been on the Today Show, Good Morning America, New Day, Fox and Friends. He should be on major American morning shows, not just on a British morning show on the radio. That, I think, is a tragedy.
There's a fundamental issue, Brian, about how all this is playing out. It's life and death. It's critically important. The facts having not gotten to people has resulted in sickness and in many cases death. What should the media do about a problem of this magnitude?
Partly we go and book other experts when the government's leaders are not available. So because the CDC has been kind of, I don't want to say totally muzzled, but they've certainly been half silenced, halfway muzzled. When other government agencies are being heads down and trying to avoid the press, then we've got to go find others. And I think some of the most compelling interviews on television have been the interviews inside hospitals, right? Access inside hospitals, interviewing leaders of the hospital, and the same for newspapers. I think it was a pivotal moment on March 25th when the New York Times published videos and interviews from inside Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, Donald Trump's home borough, by the way, where the doctors said this is apocalyptic. And we were pretty far along the timeline at that point, but it was still a turning point to hear the nurses and doctors cry for help the way they did through the media. So there's been a lot of exemplary reporting in that way. And we're seeing it again now. Look at Houston and San Antonio and CNN's Miguel Marquez inside those hospitals. It's hard to get access, but it's worth fighting for.
I want to say hi to our guests that have joined us, Paula Kiger from Tallahassee, Florida, Aparna, thank you, our welcome always guest, Peter Kreisky, and many more. And Brian, I wanted to ask you, we were talking about this information tragedy, and the White House was having daily press briefings at one point. They were spectacles that included a lot of misinformation. So what do you think balances there?
Right. That's you're the opposite of a troll, Alex. But when I get trolls in my Twitter replies, what they say is, "You used to complain about the briefings. Why weren't you happy with the briefings?" Like, that's a really popular troll message. And what I say to the trolls when I'm in the mood to reply and I've had a couple drinks is I say, the American people deserve frequent and accurate briefings, frequent and honest briefings. And we were getting frequent briefings, but not honest briefings. And that's actually what's happening now with the White House press secretary. Kayleigh McEnany now is having frequent briefings, but they're mostly media bashing sessions, not very newsworthy, not very reliable. So CNN doesn't really broadcast them. Neither does MSNBC, which I think is an interesting new kind of stance to take with the White House. So I think that's the point. Look, here's an interesting thought experiment. Okay, let's pretend it's the end of March. And President Trump gave one address to the nation on like March 11th or 12th. It didn't go well. But imagine if the White House had said to the major broadcast networks and the major cable networks and NPR, we want to do a weekly update to the nation about the pandemic. And we're going to bring in Dr. Anthony Fauci, and we're going to bring in, yes, President Trump will be there, but we're going to have experts there. And we're going to have Tom Hanks there because he's been sick with COVID. Like, we're going to have celebrities and we're going to have experts and we're going to get the nation through this together. That would be the biggest show in America. It would actually still be on. It would be the biggest show in America. Everybody would watch or at least read about it the next morning. And the fact that there hasn't been anything like that, any daily briefing, any weekly briefing, no attempt to unite the country around a shared information source. I don't know, Merrill and Alex, maybe that's just because the country is too broken to rely on a single source like that. But if ever there were a time for something like that, it would have been now.
When we're not only talking about political consensus here, Brian, we're talking about actual human behaviors that would have been influenced had a version of what FDR would have called a fireside chat had happened on a regular basis. How different the discussion would have been. Imagine today we finally got the governor of Texas to acknowledge masks as a requirement.
Right. I mean, look, Andrew Cuomo in New York, it was the closest thing to what I'm describing by having those daily briefings. Gavin Newsom in California, kind of similar. Some of the other governors have done a good job locally in getting their populations together with a message of love and unity and resilience. But there hasn't been an attempt to do that nationally. It was the opposite, right? There was disinformation spread nationally by the president. And I know that we're also immune to it. It's the one thing we're all immune to is the president's lies. But having just written a book about this, so my book Hoax, which you mentioned about Fox and Trump, I had to obviously write a new ending and a new beginning about COVID. When you go back and you recreate the timeline about January and February and March, it is astonishing what was going on in February when this virus was silently spreading across the country and Trump was more interested in Roger Stone. Like, at the end of March, the death toll is rapidly rising and he's more interested in ratings. That kind of stuff, I know we're all numb to it. When I went and revisited it for the purposes of a nonfiction book that I hope will be around on a bookshelf in years, it is mind-blowing. It makes you wonder, like, what will this disaster movie be about? What will it be named? I asked James Fallows of The Atlantic that question today, and he said it's Titanic. This is Titanic. This is the biggest disaster movie of all time. Because the warnings were available, the warnings were accessible. There was awareness of an iceberg ahead, but the country steamed right into it anyway.
Brian, we have a question from Larry Kramer in Hilton Head, South Carolina. Would something like the BBC in the US, national or local, help ensure more consistent local coverage and provide a trusted single source of information for everyone?
I'd love to know what you all think. I'm certainly a believer that we should have more investment in public media. I used to fight with this with my late mentor, David Carr. David would say I was wrong and I was crazy to think that there should be more funding for the PBSs and the NPRs of the world, and that the last thing we need is more government-funded media. I think two things about that. One, I think the environment's changed in the country in terms of commercial media. And I think number two, when you look at models like the British model, which I know is under threat, it's amazing how little Americans spend on public media. So I personally, in a dream of vision, it's never going to happen sort of environment, would love to see 10 times the funding for publicly financed news. But would it regain trust? Perhaps is a different question, right? Would it win trust among folks who have been told for decades to hate the media? I assume it would not. But I still think it would be a public service for the rest of the country. Sorry, my daughter just walked in. I just have to give her one little hug. Sonny, say hi. You say hi. She just got back from the park.
Hi, Sonny.
You having a good day?
This is a real moment.
I'll be free in like half an hour. I'm going to talk to my friends a little bit more. Is that okay? And then after dinner? The park is so good. She's a little bit wet from the sprinklers. All right. After dinner, we're going to be playing, okay? What are we going to play? Soccer?
But I need to take a bath first.
Yeah, oh, of course. It's bath time. All right. That's okay, we got a plan. Sorry, guys.
Brian?
That's okay. Bath time. Right after bath time, I'll be free. Okay. Sorry, it's okay. We actually had it happen on CNN last week, and I was a little embarrassed. And then viewers loved it. People were like, because it's happening to everybody. It's everybody's life.
Right.
Yeah.
Brian,
that's on the BBC.
Brian, that's one kind of pressure the reporters face. Children showing up on their laps. But there's another kind, and that is to find sources. And the cable news networks and local newspapers and everybody's trying to find credible sources. It's as if we're almost dependent on whistleblowers at this point. Are you finding that at CNN? Do you find that as you try to dig in and actually find stuff out?
Well, look at this story about Afghanistan and these Russian bounties. I think there's a question about why did those sources go to the New York Times? David Sanger of the Times said to me that one thesis here is it's because the internal whistleblowing system has been so compromised that the internal IG system to blow the whistle on wrongdoing or problems, it has been blown up essentially by the Trump administration. And so as a result, these people went and leaked to reporters. And I do think that's an extreme example, perhaps, or a very dramatic, but I think there are a lot of other examples of that throughout government that we are seeing. And, look, the New York Times benefits from those leaks. I'd like to think CNN benefits from those leaks sometimes. I don't personally, given my beat on media, but I think a lot of national security reporters are sensing that, there are sources who might call the IG who are calling them instead.
That's very interesting. And multiple phenomena coming together at once. Alex?
Right.
So,
Alex?
Brian, in addition to being a challenge for newsrooms, COVID is a challenge to their very existence. Can you tell our audience what the effect of the pandemic has been on local news in particular?
Right. It's this is the other version of the information tragedy, because tragically there are fewer reporters on beats in local communities because of the pandemic. I mean, this is the pandemic paradox. I would say it this way. More interest in the news, more concern about what's going on, but fewer ad dollars, and thus fewer dollars to pay reporters, and thus fewer reporters on the beat. And it is a paradox. It doesn't make sense at first blush because there's such an intense interest in the news right now. But there's not equivalent support for the news, meaning subscriber dollars. I know that you all know the story, but I do think it's important to keep reiterating with average newspaper readers, average television viewers. I have a banner that we use on my show as often as we can. Every Sunday, I try to use it at least once a month, being like, if you want your local news to survive, subscribe. I think we have to make it that blunt and that simple, and that and make people feel like they have skin in the game, because we know they do, but I don't think most viewers are still, and most readers are still that aware of how important their support is.
Absolutely. Such a good point. And Merrill, speaking of support for journalism, can you tell our viewers a little bit about what we do at TNP?
Thanks, Alex. So we're proud of what we do at TNP, working with news organizations to help them technologically, to help them with business development, and to help entrepreneurs start news sites that help fill voids in news categories, local and national. Here's a list of the kind of things we do. We have technology, so what's called a content management system. We have a team of experts, Alex being one great example. We do audience development and help people grow their sites. We help people with revenue models. We help them develop partnerships, and we give them data they can use, which is really important, especially for small news sites that can't really afford the kind of data infrastructure that, say, a CNN or a New York Times has. So that's the News Project. If you're interested in what we're doing, if you run a news site, if you'd like to start one, please contact me or Alex. You can reach me at Merrill@thenewsproject.net, or you can reach Alex at thenewsproject.net. Please be in touch with us, and thank you for listening to our little plug. And now back to Brian.
I like Merrill. You said if you'd like to start one, that always gets me interested.
Brian, let's do it.
I always figure that I've got another something new in me someday. When you mentioned, you were kind enough to, in your intro, to mention TV Newser, which is this blog I started like 16 years ago. And I never viewed it as a business. And that was my fatal flaw, my mistake. I was just a hobbyist. I was just having fun. I didn't view it as a business. And I think I've always wondered in the back of my head, okay, if I could do it over again, how would I do it differently? And, that's always calling at me back here.
Well, it
You were
merely
in college, though, Brian. I think
I
we did it
was
pretty
only a freshman. I was only a freshman. I didn't know better.
and it only led to a job at the New York Times. So that's a pretty good ROI.
So I just want to say hi to
Yeah, go ahead.
joining us. Sunny Slaughter, Tim Sohn, Stefan Kaplan. Thank you guys for joining. Peter Kreisky and many more. And Brian, I wanted to get back to the misinformation. We talked about it a little bit, the misinformation coming out of the White House around COVID, but that is not the only source, obviously. Can you tell us some of the major sources of misinformation during this crisis?
My mind immediately goes to pro-Trump media. When I say pro-Trump media, I mean Fox, but I also mean radio shows and right-wing websites. We didn't used to talk this way about presidents. It didn't used to always be pro-Bush, anti-Bush. We didn't talk pro-Obama, anti-Obama. It almost sounds silly to say those words. Like, yes, was there a little bit of that? Yes. Could you identify media outlets along those lines? Sure. But this is so different. And I like to stop and remember every once in a while how weird this is. That pro-Trump, anti-Trump, like the country didn't used to be this divided over a guy, a man, a single person before. Anyway, I digress. I think that what we've seen is mostly homegrown mis and disinformation, meaning, folks who want an excuse not to wear a mask, who tell their Facebook friends about some debunked study about losing oxygen supply when you wear a mask. I think it's mostly that kind of wanting to make excuses, wanting to rationalize poor decisions, and then spreading those messages to other people and spreading them widely, unfortunately, and increasingly, of course, hard to see how widely, because a lot of this is happening in private Facebook groups. This is happening in private text messaging chains, so we can't really see what's spreading.
Brian, we want to talk about social media a bit, but I also want to get a little personal with you about how you view your opinions as they creep onto the air. I mean, anchors today, and you are a very different anchor than traditional anchors were, who read basically wire service copy and covered the news. You see that role, as others do at CNN, much differently. It's been an evolving role. How do you think about that?
I blanch at the word opinion, and I would try to spin you and say that it's not opinion, it's perspective. Does that work? Or I would say it's not opinion, it's analysis. Or I would say if I'm observing a pattern and I've seen the pattern 100 times, I can now describe the pattern accurately in a way that's reporting, but that sounds feisty and provocative, right? The president leads a hate movement against the media. I think that is just a provable, that's been proven 100 times. But it is absolutely different than, 2 generations of CNN ago or 2 generations of other channels before. And I think you do see it actually more with CNN than the broadcast networks. The broadcast networks still aim for the word broad. They try to appeal to everybody. Not that cable doesn't, but I think some of my colleagues at broadcast networks feel hamstrung by this desire to seem like they are just down the middle in that kind of old-fashioned classic journalism textbook way. And I think at CNN, the attitude is much more call out lying and indecency wherever it is. And right now, it comes a lot more from the right than the left. So we're going to talk a lot more about Trump lying because he's lying a lot more than any other any Democrat. So does that seem like it's anything other than the center? I don't care as long as it's true, as long as it's accurate, as long as it's accurate about the way the world works. And I would just give you one example. I go back to January 23rd, 24th, the first week of the Trump presidency, the day that he said 3 to 5 million people voted illegally, which is such a disgusting lie, such a crazy lie that we just, now it's Trump now. We just get used to it, right? But I went on air that day. As soon as he said it, I was sitting with Brooke Baldwin on set in New York, and back when we could be on set together, right? And and I said to Brooke, and I got my voice got really low and I got really quiet because when I get really angry and I get really disturbed, I get kind of quiet. And I said, Brooke, this is crazy. This is a crazy statement. This is a crazy thing for a president to say. What's he going to say next? Is the moon made of green cheese? And it kind of just came out, kind of just like slipped out. And I wondered afterwards, like, did I go too far? Did I say the wrong thing? And the White House did complain. We got a phone call from somebody at the White House that complained about it. But there was no backlash, no concern inside CNN, no wrist slap. Instead, I think it's the opposite. If he says something crazy, we have to call it out. And I think in 20 years, when we look back, the news outlets that didn't call it out when things were really crazy, they're going to look really bad, aren't they? I mean, look, I don't want to go judging folks at other networks, but
well, you wrote a book doing so, apparently.
Merrill, I don't want to have regrets. I think that's where it comes in. I don't want to look back in 20 years and say that I shut my mouth when we needed to open our mouths as loudly as possible, right?
Right.
Enemy of the people. Like, how in the hell did Hope Hicks and Reince Priebus allow Trump to say that? How did that happen? Now, their excuse, what they always say is, well, he's the president. You're not the president. He's the president. By that point, when he said enemy of the people, I realized there's nobody in charge, right? And in that environment, I think that journalism has to change. We can't cover it like any normal situation when he's lying and he's smearing and he's leading a hate movement against. Now, that said, when he says things accurately, we should report it. When he achieves success on behalf of the United States, it's newsworthy. Like, I don't think this means we're just reflexively looking for bad news about Trump or looking for bad news about anybody. I just think we have to call out when we see lying and indecency. Is that too long?
It's a great answer, but it's important to note that CNN took some heat today for not carrying his briefing about the job situation.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's a change in strategy. I have not talked to the bosses about it. I don't know what that. I don't know if it's a purposeful change in strategy actually, or if it's just a couple of coincidences here and there. But I think there is an argument to be made that if someone shows you who they are for 3 years and much of the time they're using their platform to lie and mislead, then you have to cover them differently. And I think we actually might look back and say, why didn't that happen sooner?
Right. Brian, we have a question from Peter Kreisky. Is there any evidence that Trump is again planning his own network?
That's interesting. That happens to come up in Hoax, which comes out August 25th or 28th. 25th. I better remember that as that before I forget. At the end of the book, I bring up this possibility that if Trump does not win re-election, that he will launch his own network and challenge Fox. Like, to me, what's interesting about that is, could he challenge the network that has kept his base with him for the past 3.5 years? And the answer is maybe. I don't think I don't think anyone knows the exact answer to that question. But I would add this caveat. If President Biden is inaugurated in January and now former President Trump hosts a webcast and tries to create TrumpTV.com, we will all be surprised by how little viewers it gets. Like, I think the news then will be, wow, nobody's really watching. And when I say nobody, what I mean is 100,000. But Sean Hannity gets 5 million viewers a night. If Donald Trump thinks he can go and recreate Fox News on a dime, he's going to be sorely mistaken.
Right.
Alex, social media. We were going to make sure Brian doesn't escape without talking about Facebook a little bit.
Right. So, the two major stories right now with Facebook and in the country are the pandemic and the wild misinformation that you alluded to spreading crazily over social media, and, hate on social media in light of the George Floyd protests. And, there's this advertiser boycott, but Zuckerberg came out today saying, we're not going to change our strategy around this. And what are your insights around this and regulation in general for social media networks?
I had Facebook spokesman Nick Clegg on my CNN program on Sunday, and he said at one point, we're talking about hate speech. There's no room for hate speech on Facebook. But remember, most of what people are seeing on Facebook, most of what they're experiencing is positive. It's friends and family. And so during this interview, we had taken Nick full screen. So I pulled up my Facebook page and I started searching my personal Facebook newsfeed. And, he's right about my experience on Facebook. It's posts from friends and college buddies and high school friends and parents. And I do think that's the average experience on Facebook. But what I then said to Nick when I came back on camera was, what about that minority of folks who are going down these crazy rabbit holes and are getting radicalized on Facebook? Because, even if they are just a minority, I think they are just a minority of folks, but that is still too many. It's still too dangerous. And Facebook still has to take more responsibility than it has so far in that radicalization. A great example from the Times' Kevin Roose last week being a lie about Black Lives Matter activists vandalizing the Vietnam Memorial when it wasn't Black Lives Matter activists, and it wasn't. It was a years old picture that was taken out of context. Someone made up a lie and it spread to hundreds of thousands of people. And I went on that liar's webpage, and he posts lots of memes, crazy memes. Most of them are not lies. Like, most of them are not literally untrue. They're just super hyper partisan. They're super hateful and, just the worst division you can imagine day after day. And that is poison. Like, that is a version of poison. And I don't think that Facebook has good answers to the questions about that poison. I know what they're able to say about hate speech. There's no room for hate speech. We try to block it. When we see it, we delete. Like, they've got those answers. What's a lot harder to answer is the divisive content. And is that what we want the internet to be? And is that what we as users want? I'm kind of at a loss to answer those questions, Alex.
Brian, we're compelled to come back to Fox again, not merely to promote your book.
Well, Fox is exactly related to this. Talk about divisive content.
Of course.
Half the memes on Facebook come from Fox News.
But you and your colleagues have been tracking the Fox program lineups to make a point about what they're prioritizing, what they're not. And that's been very interesting. It's interesting substantively, but it's really also interesting to watch TV networks compare program lineups to one another. Another part of the moment we're in that was kind of unimaginable. I mean, imagine Lester Holt leading with a story about David Muir's lineups that night. It would be inconceivable. It would be inconceivable in that universe, and yet you're doing it, and it's interesting and tells us something. Elaborate on that, would you please?
So I was going to start by saying I have different days, different moods. Some days I think that the whole Two Americas conceit is vastly overstated, right? Like I was just telling you before we came on, I just sat in traffic for the last 2 hours, and I was driving across all of the city, and most people are just like, most people don't care that much about the news. Most people do not care that much about Trump. Most people just want to get home and relax with their families. And they're not interested in those insane memes on Facebook, and they're not interested in Trump's lies about voter fraud. When I'm in this mood today, I think Two Americas, we're not really two Americas. We're not as screwed up as it seems. But when I turn on Fox News, it is clear that we are divided much more than I think it's normally appreciated. When you watch World News Tonight with David Muir, or you watch Lester Holt on the Nightly News, you don't see how split off into two bubbles we are in media-wise. Because the nightly newscasts and CNN, we mostly just cover like normal, like we just tell you what's up with the pandemic. When you watch Fox and Friends at 6 a.m., as I do every morning, because my baby's awake, my 11-month-old's always up at 5:30. They don't mention the pandemic for 15 minutes. They literally don't mention COVID until 6:14, 6:15. They spend the first 15 minutes talking about statues and police funding, and it makes it sound like New York City is a fucking disaster, like a violent wasteland, even though they're broadcasting from New York City, which is kind of funny. It is a different, they are not describing America that I live in. They're describing a different America. So like, that is why I think it's important to cover what Fox is doing and what OAN is doing. I see someone mentioning OAN in the comments, what Sinclair is doing. Most of Sinclair is just straightforward, plain vanilla local news. But then Eric Bolling goes to the White House and his questions to Trump have no relationship to what I'm experiencing in this country as a voter. So that's why I think media reporters have to analyze the content of these channels. And by the way, totally fair game to analyze CNN's content, right? We led with the pandemic. We do basically 45 minutes an hour on the pandemic. It is by far the biggest story. But the obsession with statues, the obsession with monuments, the obsession with police defunding, the obsession with radical opinions that have no political power, that all fucks up Trump's head. Sorry, that all screws up Trump's head. It all gets into his head. And it all explains why he is misleading the public about this stuff, right? Like the other day, Trump called out this, what he says is a Black Lives Matter slogan, which is pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon, which is sick. That's not a BLM slogan. That was chanted at a single protest like 5 years ago, but it was caught on camera. And Sean Hannity plays that video as much as he can. So to Trump, that's a real thing. Like to Trump, that is an active slogan that's actively being chanted all the time. And honestly, I don't think the network newscasts, I don't think the big papers fully acknowledge how warped that other American media bubble is. And I'm not sure if they should, like, I don't know what the right answer is, but I can tell you, like, as someone who watches a lot of Fox News, it's so much different a depiction of America than what we're used to. And it explains a lot of what's wrong with our politics. And so I think we just have to keep documenting it again and again and keep pointing out, oh yeah, Sean Hannity had an hour-long talk call. Sean Hannity had an hour with the president. What a blessing. Like, what a gift. You get an hour with the president to interview him on live TV. 3 minutes on the pandemic.
Right.
And no boss tells him to change that. Nobody, he doesn't get in trouble at work. There's nobody there telling him to do it better next time. Well, now I'm starting to give away parts of the book, so I'll stop. But it's a big story. That's why I think it's a big deal.
That was our mission, to get you to reveal the book. Brian. Mission accomplished. Alex?
Well, staying in the right-wing sphere, but alluding to the question that you saw earlier, this is from Philip. While Fox News and OAN are doubling down on defending Trump, what do you make of Sinclair pulling back?
Right. So Sinclair pulling back means they've cut their commentaries. They stopped having conservative and progressive commentary segments. So what do I make of that? It's a business calculation. I think they look at their minute-by-minute ratings, and they find that local news viewers in Topeka, I'm making up a city, I'm not sure if they're in Topeka, don't really want to hear from Boris Epstein. If the ratings drop in those 2 minutes, then Sinclair's not going to keep doing it. And I think that's the right play. If you're local news, be local news. Be what you're really good at. I love my wife's channel, New York One, but this morning they went live to the White House for the president's speech, and I was like, "But you're New York One. Like, I want to hear from you, not the president. If I want to watch the president, I'll go to CNN." I think that for Sinclair, I think they're wisely doing what's right for their business and trying to give people local news. That's my best impression. I've only checked in with a few sources there recently, but that's my impression.
I want to remind our viewers to send us another question or two. We have just another segment or so left, but I want to make sure we get to one more topic, Brian, and that is we can't ignore that there's a revolution going on in America's newsrooms right now. It's about the protests. It's about equality. It's about diversity and hiring. It's a very important, fragile moment in the newsrooms that you and I and Alex have worked in and that are getting so much attention today. What do you make of this revolution?
Yeah. First, I don't think I'm the best to comment on it because I think, we're hearing, for my job in a moment like this is to book the best, most diverse, most representative voices. And I think at one essay in June, I started my show by saying, like, all right, I'm going to shut up now and hand it over. Like that I think is the right. The the answer for the hosts. You notice on TV, a lot of the times we ask a question and then we keep talking, and it's best to ask the question. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody in TV news in terms of questions that are too long and too rambling. Although you all have been very pithy tonight, I have to say. What I think is so incredible about the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and the Los Angeles Times and these other examples of this newsroom reckoning about racism is that these rank and file journalists feel empowered and are willing and able and are doing it. They are standing up to management and in some cases, risking their careers in doing so. So I think we need to shine as much light on them as we can, because that's the best way to support them. It's harder to fire a pesky reporter who is speaking out and trying to make sure their newsroom is more diverse. It's harder to fire that person when there's a lot of attention pointed at them and a lot of support from the community and a lot of interest. So, that's what I think we can do on the outside, is to support those journalists who are pushing for change and trying to make sure, fundamentally, this shouldn't be hard. Newsrooms should look like their communities. Shouldn't be hard, but it has been hard over years.
Are you optimistic?
I'm very optimistic right now. I am. Well, on the front about these reckonings in newsrooms, yes, because I think the interests of the readers and the interests of the reporters and the interests of the management actually all basically align. I'm sure maybe I'm wrong, and people in the comments can tell me if I'm wrong, but it's in the interest of the business. It's in the interest of the editorial to make sure that a community that is 1/3 African American and 1/3 Hispanic and the rest other races is represented by a newsroom that looks the same way. I think their interests are aligned. I hope they are.
Right. So let's get to some comments that you alluded to. Neil, if you can pop those up on the screen. Stephen Kaplan says, "That's the line of the night with Brian." So Cutie says, "Now we've got a plan. Gotta love it."
A plan. Sonny, she just needs a plan, and her favorite question right now is why? Why is it, Daddy? Why? And we go down. I mean, I really feel like she's a reporter in training with all the questions.
And Carla says, "Hi, Brian. I remember when you were breaking news on TV User, then sharing it with NYT."
Thank you, Carla. Hi, Carla.
Tim Stone says, "Hi, Brian. I remember hearing of you from TV User, which was later acquired by Media Bistro, right? I used to freelance for Media Bistro. Always a lot to learn from your show."
I sold it to Media Bistro for beer money, but it was worth it. It was a great job. I was in college. It was a perfect job.
There you go. And finally, from Jennifer Lazarus, huge Brian Stelter fan, great conversation.
Thank you.
Brian, we've covered a lot of territory, and it was great having you. Alex, you a final thought?
No, I think this is a great discussion. Thank you, everyone who sent questions and comments, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
And there will be a next time. We'll be on July 9th. Brian, we're going to have you back to talk about that book, which we can't wait to read.
Thank you.
July 9th, we'll be on, but we have a special guest on July 16th we want to announce and share with you all. She is Goli Shakola-Slami. She is the CEO of WNYC Radio, and as such, one of the most important, interesting, and powerful people in public radio at a very large, I believe the largest public radio operation in the country. So we'll have her with us on Thursday, July 16th at 6. Thank you all for watching. Brian, thank you all for deferring baths and dinner for people.
That's right.
People way more important than the two of us and even our large audience tonight. Thank you all for your questions, for joining in, for spending a little bit of your evening with the News Project Live. And this was a very good conversation with Brian. Share it with your friends, because I'll tell you, on tape tonight at 7 or 8 or over the long weekend, it'll be just as interesting a conversation on demand as it was live. And you can stop and fast forward through children if you'd like, or pause on them and take pictures of them if you will. But please tune in, share this with your friends. Brian, thank you. And thank you, Alex, for tonight's program. And to the audience, thank you again for watching, and please tune in again next Thursday. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.